This is an edited version of a program I gave for the Riverbend Photo and Video Club. That program included a couple of great examples of time-lapse video, plus clips from online tutorials. We will post links to those resources on the club website. It turns out that there are many different ways to record a time-lapse, but the least complicated by far is to make it right in the camera.
I'm going to call this Method 1. Some cameras feature a built-in intervalometer or timer, which can be set to take pictures at a fixed interval. Other cameras go a step further and combine these pictures in the camera into a video file. Here are 3 cameras that can make a time-lapse in the camera: an iPhone, a Fuji XP90 action camera, and a Canon 5D4. For a long time you wouldn't find this feature in a higher-end camera, but now almost every new camera that comes out has got this feature, and I think it's on its way to become pretty much a standard feature. By the way, that clock time-lapse that we started with was shot with this little Fuji camera. You will need your camera manual and a tripod. You will set the exposure mode, then you'll be prompted to set the interval between pictures and the number of pictures. The other method is to take a series of individual pictures and combine them using external software. In planning this out, you will need to know how long the event will be and how long you want your video clip to be. Here's an example. Let's say the event is 2 hours long. There are 7,200 seconds in 2 hours. A 20-second video at 30 frames per second will have 600 frames. So you would divide 7,200 by 600, and that would give you 1 frame every 12 seconds. Should you use manual or auto exposure and white balance? If you're using an auto mode, the camera needs to meter before every shot. Inevitably, there will be a slight variation in metering between shots, and the result is flickering even if the light is steady. But if the lighting changes, you'll need to adjust the exposure. You can't notice that your exposure is off until after it changes. The result, again, is a flickering in your time-lapse. Depending on the subject, you may not even notice, but in any case, it can be fixed in post. This is the clock video that we started with. This was shot in program mode. Notice in the white parts how it's flickering. How long of an exposure? The exposure that you use with a time-lapse may not be the same as the exposure that you would choose to take a picture. This is because people often want to have motion blur in their time-lapse. If your exposures are too short, the video will be jerky. If they're too long, moving objects may not even register. For example, if you have a street scene, if your exposures are short, people will pop into view and out of view. If your exposures are too long, people may ghost out of the frame altogether unless they're standing still. Some people advised half of the frame interval. If you're shooting in daylight, this may require that you need a neutral density filter in order to avoid overexposure. And for street shots, some people recommend that you start with 2 seconds. Tripping the shutter, an internal intervalometer, an external intervalometer, remote shutter, or you can press the shutter button with your finger. Here are a couple of examples of less than perfect time lapses. The first one is the Milky Way reflected on the Vermilion River in Minnesota. This time lapse is short because it only has about 130 frames. Before I slowed it down, it was less than 4 seconds long. This is because I was using a 20-second exposure for these shots. I was shooting without a timer, just pushing the shutter again after each shot. Getting enough shots is always a problem with nighttime time lapses. You need to be prepared to stay out there a long time. This next one is the first time lapse I ever attempted. One summer morning, we had a hibiscus plant on the deck and beautiful, soft, warm morning light. The hibiscus had a bud that was ready to open, and I thought it would make a great time lapse. I was guessing that it would take 30 minutes to an hour for it to open. It turned out to be closer to 3 hours. After about 30 minutes, the beautiful light was gone, and I realized that my pictures were now overexposed. This was a problem for a couple of reasons. First, the camera was positioned so that I couldn't see the rear screen, so I ended up moving the camera and starting over. More important, every time I changed the exposure, you could see it in the time lapse. I had accidentally discovered a major issue in doing time lapse, getting the exposure right when the lighting changes. In fact, getting smooth day-to-night transitions is known as the holy grail of time-lapse photography. The source of this problem is that your eyes and your camera don't see things the same way. I ran into the same problem when planning for the 2017 solar eclipse. I wanted to record a video of the landscape getting dark during the eclipse. This had to be automated because I planned to record the eclipse itself at the same time. At first, I thought this should be simple. I would set the camera on manual, and when the sky got dark, my video would get dark. This was embarrassingly wrong. If I set the camera for a good exposure at 1 o'clock on a sunny August afternoon, it would be underexposed and go dark long before the sun went down. On the other hand, if I used an auto mode, the camera's light meter would compensate for the twilight and it never would go dark. Here's the one solution that I came up with. Set the camera to its widest aperture. Find a combination of shutter speed and ISO that results in an underexposure when it starts to get dark. Then set your camera to shutter priority with those values. This should result in your pictures becoming underexposed at the same time that the sun goes down. There is, however, a way this can be fixed in post, and we'll get to that in just a moment. Once you have your time-lapse photos, there are many different programs you can use to put it together. If you're shooting time-lapse in the camera, you're already done. Lightroom can also do it. You can make a time-lapse directly from the slideshow module, but you would be limited to 1 second per slide. This may be okay depending on your subject. For instance, a building going up might work just fine. If not, you can download time-lapse templates, either from Adobe or third parties, to make a real time lapse at 24, 30, or 60 frames per second. Photoshop can also do it, of course. Just ask the internet for directions. Virtually any video editing program can also put together a time lapse, such as Premiere or iMovie. Premiere Pro is what I use. Then there is LR Timelapse. This program works with either Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw and basically solves all your time-lapse problems. It even has something called the Holy Grail Wizard. It does this by using keyframes. Keyframes are used in video editing. Let's say you have a graphic that you want to move across the screen. You would place it where you want to start, make a keyframe, then move down the timeline and put your graphic where you want it to end. Then you'd make another keyframe. When the video is rendered, the program will interpolate the position for the in-between frames and the graphic will move across the screen. LR Timelapse can do this with exposure and white balance, so any flickering is wiped away and the exposure changes are perfectly smooth. If you see a really pro-looking time-lapse, there's a good chance that they've used this program. The cost of this program ranges from free for the free version to over $300 for the pro version. Finally, I should mention camera movement. The current style in video is that the camera is almost always moving. It's so common that you can now make a dramatic statement by not moving the camera. The result is a huge variety of panners, sliders, dollies, etc. to keep the camera moving. The extreme version of this is hyperlapse, where the whole tripod is moved between shots. We'll post a link for this last clip. It shows people using pan, tilt, zoom, and hyperlapse all at the same time.